Before starting this video, I do want to give a thank you to my patrons that support the channel. And if you would like to support the channel, there are some great benefits for you in the link down below. So with that, let's get into today's video. Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Devin coming back at you with another video today on PubStompMTG. So we're continuing through Wilds of Eldraine, and we got another version of Korvold with Korvold Gleeful Glutton for 8 mana. Don't let that high mana cost fool you, because this spell will cost 1 less to cast for each card type among permanents you sacrifice this turn. He does have Flying, Trample, and Haste, really good stats for evasion, and on top of that he could get through damage. And on top of that, whenever Korvold deals combat damage to a player, you put X +1 counters on Korvold and draw X cards, where X is the number of permanent types among cards in your graveyard. Whew. Alright, so after catching my breath, I do feel like this is a less powerful version compared to the previous Korvold, in my opinion. I mean, don't get me wrong, I feel like it's pretty powerful. However, with this version of Korvold, he is just restricted with permanent types such as Planeswalker, Creature, Enchantment, Artifact, Lands, or Battle. In most situations, I feel like Creature, Artifact, and Land is probably going to be the easiest way where you're going to sacrifice permanents. So I feel like with Korvold Gleeful Gun, in most cases, because you're probably going to be sacrificing creatures, artifacts, or lands, it's probably going to be reduced to about 5 mana total, which is honestly pretty good on par, especially with the previous Korvold. He does have haste though, so that what gives him an edge a little bit. However, this is a very tame version of Korvold, especially compared to the previous one. But if you do have enough cards in your graveyard, you could potentially draw 6 cards every combat, so honestly that's really good value just by itself. So you may want to consider going into a little bit of a self-mill theme along with a little bit of a sacrifice theme. You don't need to go into the sacrifice theme too much, is what I've kind of realized, is because you just have to get Korvold on the battlefield, and if you have him on the battlefield, you're just going to be gaining value based off of the cards that are in your graveyard. So personally, I would go more for a self-mill theme compared to a sacrifice theme, because you're in green, you have a lot of ways to ramp out Korvold. So I do feel like a lot of people are going to try to gravitate towards that first option of trying to reduce him as fast as possible so he can get on the battlefield. However, honestly, you probably want to go with a self-mill theme, just in my opinion. Even if you sacrifice a treasure and sacrifice a creature, he's going to be reduced by 2, and honestly a 6 mana for this amazing card is pretty good value. So with that, the next step of the deck is figuring out what kind of route we want to go with Korvold. So for example, there are ways to get him out a little bit early. I know I mentioned that you don't want to focus on it too much, however there is a little bit of a focus on there with different cards and different synergies. So with this strategy, I did want to follow a couple different things. I did want to focus on some permanents being sacrificed. For example, fetch lands, they're a no-brainer in this deck because they kind of act like a super type. You sacrifice a fetch land, Korvold also gets cheaper, and you do get a land on the battlefield. So fetch lands are an easy auto-include. Some other auto-includes, because if we do want to sacrifice some of our creatures, we'd want free ways to do that, like having Phyrexian Altar and Ashnod's Altar on the battlefield. So if we do sacrifice a creature, we will reduce the cost of Korvold, and on top of that, we could get some mana out of it, especially with Ashnod's Altar getting 2 mana. Honestly, that's very good, and with Phyrexian Altar, we could get a specific type of mana we do need for Korvold, like a green, black, or a red source. Other ways we could sacrifice permanents is by having treasures. So for example, Professional Facebreaker is a great example, mainly because we could get some treasure out of combat with her. Plus, on top of that, it does have Menace, so in most situations, you're going to get a treasure out of Professional Facebreaker, and on top of that, you could get some card advantage, kind of, out of her if you sacrifice a treasure. Another easy auto-include in the deck is Dockside Extortionist, mainly because when it enters the battlefield, you'll make treasure, and when you get treasure out on the battlefield, you'll reduce the cost of Korvold, and most likely you're going to be able to cast Korvold based off of the treasure you do get with Dockside. Don't get me wrong, Dockside Extortionist is way more busted in Korvold Fakehurst King than in this version of Korvold. However, it's still really good overall if you're getting treasure out of Dockside to cast Korvold. So with that out of the way, I did also want to talk about Korvold's ability to draw cards based off of the permanents you do have in the graveyard. So you do want to fill your graveyard with different permanent types. So for example, if you do have a card like Haywire Might on the battlefield, it's probably a perfect example of what you can do with Korvold. In a way, this kind of acts like a ritual for Korvold because it's an artifact creature, so it does have 2 types off of the Haywire Might. You can sacrifice it for a green mana, and then your Korvold out of the command zone will cost 2 less, so it's almost like a little ritual for Korvold like I mentioned previously. However, it's a great addition because you could exile a target non-creature artifact or a non-creature enchantment. So with this deck, you don't really want to go a full self-mill, because if you keep on milling yourself, you're probably going to have way more permanent types in the graveyard than you do need to fill in the stipulations of Korvold to draw a lot of cards. So if you just keep self-milling yourself, you're going to be milling a lot of cards, and if you draw a lot of cards with Korvold and that keeps on happening, you could potentially lose the game by decking yourself. So a good way of doing that is by having looting effects like Faithless Looting. You draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. You could pick which permanent types you do want in the graveyard, so later on when you do attack with Korvold, you could potentially draw 2 cards based off of which permanent types you put in the graveyard. Other options you may want to consider are Deadly Dispute and also Big Score. With Deadly Dispute, you have that stipulation of sacrificing an artifact or a creature. If you do want to sacrifice a creature, that will make Korvold cost 1 less, and then if you sacrifice that treasure token you make off a Deadly Dispute, that'll be another artifact that you do sacrifice, so you make Korvold cost 2 less, and on top of that, you draw 2 cards and get an extra mana out of it to cast Korvold. So Deadly Dispute is a really good option in the deck. On top of that, with Big Score, it's a pretty good option as well, making 2 treasure tokens. You can sacrifice both of those treasure tokens, making Korvold cost 1 less to cast based off of that treasure token being sacrificed. And on top of that, you get to draw cards, so this is a good option as well. Because a good amount of cards are going in the graveyard, you may want to consider adding Ox of Agonos in the deck, mainly because it has that escape mechanic for 2 red, exile 8 other cards from your graveyard. You can kind of pick and choose which ones to exile so that you don't exile specific permanent types to draw more cards with Korvold. But when it does enter the battlefield, you can discard your hand, then draw 3 cards, so this is a pretty good fit overall, mainly because if you are running low on cards and you don't have Korvold out because it is a huge mana cost, this could be a great way to refill your hand a little bit. I will say it could also be a benefit to exile a lot of different permanents, because if you are drawing so much cards with Korvold and you are running low in your deck and you may just deck yourself, you could just exile some of your cards so that you don't have to worry about drawing more cards with Korvold when you do attack. So because you may draw a lot of cards with Korvold, you may want to have some benefits off of drawing cards. There's not a whole lot in the deck, however, I did want to mention Psychosis Crawler. So for 5 mana, whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life, and its power and toughness are based off of your hand. So if you do want that extra way of getting damage to your opponents, this is a good option. Plus on top of that, it is an artifact creature, so when it's in the graveyard, it'll count for 2 types. Another card that will count for 2 types is Starscream Power Hungry or Starscream Seeker Leader, because it has that ability when you draw a card, if you are the monarch, target opponent loses 2 life. So of course that's the main draw with this card. If you're drawing so much cards off of Korvold, this is just a way to do that. Plus having a legendary artifact creature is pretty good typing, so that again you can draw more cards based off of Korvold's ability when it's in the graveyard. On top of that, another pretty insane card in the deck would be Sheoldred the Apocalypse, mainly because you're going to be drawing so much cards, you're going to be gaining life based off of Sheoldred's ability. So in Phyrexian fashion, Sheoldred will punish your opponents for drawing cards. They will lose 2 life for each card draw that they do have. On top of that, whenever we're drawing more cards, we're going to be gaining 2 life for each card draw we do get. And especially with Korvold, if we are drawing 6 cards total based off of the permanent types that are in our graveyard, we'll potentially gain 12 life. So Sheoldred is both a great hate piece and a benefit for Korvold for sure in the deck, no question about it. So obviously Korvold does have an amazing attack trigger. We want to take advantage of that in full force. The way we could do that is by getting extra combats. So there's a lot of different cards that could grant us extra combats, like Portraiser. You could potentially get 3 extra combats just off of Portraiser alone. As long as it connects with each opponent, you're able to get the job done with Portraiser. There are also some great spells that will give us some additional combats, like Seize the Day, Savage Beating, and also Relentless Assault. Each of these will provide a great way where we could swing in with Korvold, draw some cards, get an extra combat, get some more card draw. Honestly, these are great includes in the deck, no question about it. But if you really want a consistent way of getting extra combats, Aggravated Assault is going to get the job done for you. As long as you pay 5 mana a couple times, you're going to get extra combats with all your creatures swinging in, getting Korvold triggering multiple times, getting you more card draw. This is going to be a match made in heaven for sure, especially if you get some mana enablers like Neheb the Eternal, where you get some combat damage in, you draw cards, and you can essentially get infinite combats as long as you don't draw yourself out out and deck yourself. Also, I will be honest, I completely forgot that Korvold is also putting 1/1 counters on himself when he's going into combat for each permanent type in your graveyard. I always like to focus on card draw because that's one of the most important things in the game. However, each combat you're going to go into Korvold with, the bigger he is going to get depending on how much permanent types are in your graveyard. However, he could potentially be commander lethal in most cases, especially when you get to extra combats. You're going to draw more cards, you're going to make him buffer each time. So I will say my overall opinion is they nerfed Korvold, but just by a little bit. Though this version of Korvold is not as powerful as the previous Korvold, this is still pretty dang powerful based off of because it's drawing cards and putting 1/1 counters on itself. Plus it does have flying, trample, and haste. Remember, it does have haste, so immediately when it enters the battlefield, it's going to do work. Also, adding in those extra combats, you're going to be putting a lot of 1/1 counters on Korvold and drawing a lot of cards. You could potentially get to commander lethal damage. This is basically a self-Voltron. Korvold does everything you want it to do. It's going to make itself bigger so that it could eventually go to that Voltron lethal damage of 21. And on top of that, you're going to be drawing extra cards. This is, again, a tamer version of the previous Korvold, but quite a strong one nonetheless. So with that said, I do like hearing your feedback. I love hearing feedback from the community so that it can make me a better Magic player. What do you think of Korvold? Do you think this is way too powerful or is it pretty tame? Let me know down below in the comments. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stopping by.